$4,300, Merrill Voss said, and he did not look up from his clipboard. That's what it costs to run single phase to your back pasture, Mrs. Rennick. Poles, wire, a meter, and a crew for a week. I can have men on it by spring. Ada Rennick stood on her own porch in Dovey County and did the sum out loud because she wanted the co-op man to hear it land. Her back 600 acres had earned nothing in 4 decades. Grass they had, in fair years. Water they did not. And an electric co-op priced a line by the money that line would carry home, never by what a dry pasture could pay. So the figure was not really an estimate at all. It was a polite way of saying never. That pasture would not earn a wire in her lifetime, and Voss knew it. And he was already folding the clipboard under his arm and reaching for his hat. "Think it over," he said, kindly enough. "Most folks are going the other direction this year." He was right about that. It was the autumn of 1958, and the rural electric had finally climbed into the far townships. Every farmer on the new line was pulling his windmill down the same week the meter went in. A tower brought $14 in scrap steel. $14 was money, and who wanted a groaning old mill when a switch on the wall would pump in the dark and the cold and never ask to be greased? There was a meanness in the co-op's arithmetic that Ada could not stop turning over. A wire was priced by the load it would carry, so the richer your ground, the cheaper your power. And the poorer your ground, the more it cost to serve. The men with black bottom land got their meters for a song. The woman with a dry back pasture was quoted a fortune to water it, precisely because it was dry. The system charged the most to the ground that needed help the worst. Ada watched 3 towers come down that month along the section road. She did not think the men were foolish. A pump you could start with one finger was worth having. But she kept coming back to a single stubborn fact, and the fact would not leave her alone. Her trouble had never been grass. Her trouble was that cattle will not walk to grass they cannot drink beside. Let her explain it the way her father had explained it to her, standing in that same back pasture when she was a girl. A cow grazes out from water and comes back to drink, and she will do that all day, but only so far. Push the walk past 1.5 miles and she stops gaining. Push it to 2 miles and she starts losing what she came for, burning on the road more than the far grass puts back on. So a pasture is not as big as its fence. It is only as big as the ring a cow can reach around her water. Ada had watched that truth all her life without ever naming it. In August, the near ground lay bare as a swept yard, and out past the old cross fence the grass stood belly high and silver, going to seed with no mouth to eat it. It was not that the far grass was poor. It was that no cow would trade a long walk in the heat for a bite she could get beside the tank. The fence said 600 acres. The water said 200. The water always won that argument. Ada had one good well in that whole back country, near the old homestead, and one stock tank under it. For 40 years the herd had circled that single tank like a moon that could not get loose. The 200 acres nearest the well were grazed to the roots and grazed again. The other 400 stood in tall, wasted grass a cow would never taste, because a cow cannot drink grass, and there was nothing out there to drink. Every hard winter she bought hay to cover the gap, close to $2,000 of it in a bad year, hauling feed onto ground that could have fed itself if only the water had been spread. She was paying, in plain terms, to keep 400 acres useless. Voss offered her a wire that would put a pump anywhere she could afford to reach, and she could not afford to reach anywhere at all. But there was another means of moving water, and it needed no line, no meter, no crew, and no man's permission. It needed only wind, and Dovey County had never once run short of that. That was the week Ada started driving the back roads with a list. She was not buying scrap. She was buying a fleet. She found the first 6 mills 2 townships over, already down and stacked like fence posts behind a machine shed. The farmer, a man named Emmett Thorne, could not fold his arms fast enough when she pulled in. "You're the Rennick woman," he said. "Heard you turned down the co-op." He looked at her Henley and her boots and the empty flatbed behind her truck, and he decided, right there, what kind of story this was. "Now you want my junk. I want your air motors," Ada said. "All of them. What did the scrap man quote you? 14 a tower. I'll match 'em, and I'll load them myself." Thorne laughed, and it was not a cruel laugh, only a certain one. The laugh of a man watching a neighbor do a thing he has already decided is a mistake. "Lady," he said, "the whole county's getting shut of these. Give it 2 winters and you'll be hauling them right back for scrap. Save yourself the diesel." Ada was already reaching for the first tower. She bought the rest in 1s and 2s off farms all over the county, a pair here, leaning in a shelter belt. 4 there, dropped behind a barn the week the meter came. Every farmer told her some version of the same thing, that she was buying trouble by the ton, and every one of them took her money and helped her chain the towers down, shaking his head the whole while. By the end of a fortnight, she had 22 of them lashed to the flatbed, hauled home in 6 loads over roads that rattled her teeth. 22 obsolete mills nobody in 3 counties would admit to wanting, bought for the price of the steel, stacked in her lot until they filled it. Emmett Thorne told the men at the elevator, and the men at the elevator told their wives, and inside a week the whole county knew that the Rennick woman had spent good money hauling home a graveyard. Here is the part they could not see from the road. She did not need 22 mills to make water. She needed them to keep making it. A windmill is the simplest engine on a farm and the most patient about breaking. A leather cup on the sucker rod wears thin. A cylinder scores. A pull rod snaps in a gale. Any one of those, and the mill stands dead over a full well until somebody climbs the tower with a part in his pocket. 1 mill down in July is a herd with no water in July, but a fleet is a different animal. Buy 22 identical air motors and every part fits every tower. A worn leather comes out of the parts pile, not out of a catalog 3 weeks away. 9 mills would stand in the pasture doing the work. The other 13 would wait in the shed as an organ bank, and the fleet, unlike any single mill, would never once go thirsty. That was why she took 22, and not 2. 2 would have been a gamble. 22 was insurance she only had to buy the one time. If a story like this one is worth your evening, take a moment to subscribe, because the next part is where the county's arithmetic started to change. Now she had to decide where the 9 working mills would stand, and that was not guesswork either. Her father had left her more than land. In a drawer she had the route book of the old windmill man who had drilled and serviced half of Dovey County. It was a greasy ledger from 1919. He had listed every well he knew by its static level, the depth at which water stands untouched before any pump pulls on it. Ada spent 3 nights at the kitchen table matching that book to her own back country, and the picture came clear. The homestead well was not the only water under her ground. There were 3 abandoned section wells out there, capped and forgotten when the families who dug them moved on. Their static levels were shallow, well within the reach of a windmill cylinder. Nobody had touched them in a generation, because nobody had a reason to lift water into empty grass. Ada had a reason now. She drove to the nearest of the 3 the next morning with a rope and a stone. The cap came off with a wrench and some language, and when she lowered the stone, it struck water higher than the ledger had promised, 22 feet down and standing, cold and sweet and waiting. 2 vanished families and 40 dry years, and the water had been sitting there all along. An easy pull below a pasture the whole county had written off. She capped it back and drove home doing sums. Then She laid a map on the table and drew circles, each one 1.5 miles across, one around every well she could stand a mill over. Where the circles overlapped, they covered the whole 600 acres, water within 1/2 mile of every blade of grass. The far 400, unreachable for a lifetime, would finally come inside the ring. Then the winter came, and the winter was the true price of the plan. 22 mills bought for scrap are 22 mills in scrap condition. Every cylinder had to be pulled and honed. Every leather cup was cracked or gone. Sucker rod had to be cut and coupled, gearboxes flushed of 4 decades of sludge, fans straightened blade by blade. Ada set up a bench in the barn and worked it through the short days, re-leathering cylinders with her knuckles splitting in the cold, until she could rebuild a pump head by feel with her eyes shut. She learned the trade of a windmill man one frozen part at a time. How a leather cup has to swell just so to seal against the bore and lift the column of water above it. How a rod hung out of plumb will saw through a guide in a single season. How the gearbox turns the wind shove into a patient up and down stroke that never hurries and never quits. By February, she could tell a good cylinder from a scored one by running a thumb down the inside. Standing the towers was worse. A windmill tower is 30-odd feet of galvanized steel that wants nothing so badly as to fall on the person raising it. She borrowed a gin pole and a team and taught herself to walk a tower up hand over hand, and the first one she tried got away from her. It came down slow, and then all at once, and she got clear, but the fan folded against the wellhead, and a week of bench work was bent junk in a heartbeat. She stood in the cold and looked at it a long time, and did not cry, because crying would not straighten steel. Emmett Thorne happened by 2 days later, ostensibly to return a chain. He looked at the ruined mill, and at the 21 still waiting, and he did not gloat. He was almost gentle, which was harder to take. "You don't have to prove anything out here, Ada," he said. "Nobody would think less of you for hauling these back. I'd buy them off you myself. 14 a tower. You quoted me that same 14 when you were selling," Ada said. "Now you'd pay it to buy them back." "Don't you find that curious?" Thorne didn't answer. He couldn't. "I'll stand the rest," she told him. "I just learned something about the gin pole the hard way is all." There was one more lesson the pasture made her pay for. The mill she raised over the farthest section well caught the wind and pumped, and what came up was half sand, the fine grit chewing her fresh leathers to ribbons in a week. She nearly gave that well up for lost. Then she remembered a note in the old route book about coarse gravel below the fine, drove the pipe deeper into that layer, and set a longer cylinder above it. The water ran clean after that. Every mill she raised taught her something the one before it had not. She had learned her lesson on the gin pole for good. The second tower went up clean, and the third, and by the Thaw 9 air motors stood across the back country with their fans catching the first soft wind of spring. One by one the rebuilt cylinders bit and lifted, and the first water in 40 years climbed the far pipes and rang into the tanks. The first sign was not a number. It was a sound. She heard it before she saw it, standing at the newest tank a full mile from the homestead, the small, steady knock of a working pump, and then the hiss of water going into dry galvanized. She put her hand on the rim and felt it go cold as the tank filled, and she stayed there until it ran over and darkened ground the herd had never once stood on. Within a month the cattle taught themselves the new map. They spread. Where 40 pairs had crowded the near 200 and chewed it to dirt, the herd fanned across all 600, drifting from tank to tank, grazing country no rennet cow had reached in living memory. The overgrazed near acres, rested for the first time in a lifetime, went from dirt to green to knee-high in one season. Ada walked the far ground that spring with something close to disbelief. Country she had seen only from horseback, riding out to mend a fence, was suddenly the best grazing she owned, thick and rested and ringed by water. The cattle had sorted themselves into little bunches, each one settled around its own tank. Exactly the picture she had drawn in pencil in the dead of winter. The map had come true in grass and hide. And that is when the arithmetic began to move. Rested and rotated, the 600 acres carried what the near 200 never could. She built the herd from 40 pairs toward 130, all of them watered on wind she never paid for, and grazed on grass that had stood wasted since before she was born. She bought no hay that winter. The $2,000 that used to leave every year to feed cattle on useless ground simply stayed in her pocket. The neighbors on the new line were doing their own figuring by then, and it was not going their way. Their pumps ran on the co-op's meter, and the meter never slept. Ada's ran on wind. When she sat down after the first full year and worked out what it cost her to put a pound on a calf, the answer came in near 11 cents. The electrified outfits along the line were paying closer to 19 for the same pound, and paying it to Merrill Voss every month whether the calf gained or not. Cheaper water is cheaper beef. That is the whole of it. And there is no weather and no luck in it. Only a cow that walks less and a pump that sends no bill. One of the men who had taken the co-op's wire, a younger fellow named Wade Thorne, caught her at the elevator that fall and did not bother with pride. "I'm paying the co-op near 40 a month to pump," he said. "You're telling me the wind does it for nothing." "Not for nothing," Ada said. "It cost me a winter and 22 old mills, but it never sends a bill, and it kept every tank full clear through July." Wade chewed on that. "My father pulled ours down for scrap." "So did his," Ada said. "Then I went and gathered up everybody else's." The proof the county could not argue with arrived in the fall. That was the season Ada shipped her first calf crop off the whole 600 acres, every one of them raised on wind and rested grass. She loaded them in the gray morning while the mills turned behind the loading chute, and she followed the trucks to the sale barn and sat in the stands and watched her own cattle come through the ring fat and even. The buyer's draft, when the man wrote it at the little window, came to $19,400. Ada folded it once and put it in the pocket of her Henley and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the check did not say louder. $4,300 was what the co-op had wanted to bring a wire to ground that earned nothing. $19,400 was what that same ground paid her the first year she gave it water instead. The back 40 had gone, in a single turn of the season, from a tax bill to the best money on the place, and she had never bought a foot of it, or a drop of water. She had only spread what was already there. News like that does not keep to the sale barn. It reached home ahead of her. Emmett Thorne was the first to say it plain, and to his credit he said it to her face, leaning on the same fence he had leaned on to laugh. His brother Wade stood beside him, turning a straw hat in his hands. "I sold mine for $14, Emmett said. "You hauled home the whole county's worth and turned it into a herd." He shook his head. "I've been farming 40 years, and I never once did the sum you did. I told myself the water left when the families left. It was down there the entire time." "It was always down there," Ada said. "I just stopped paying a company to hand me what the wind would carry for free." "How did you know the section wells would still make?" Wade asked, and there was no mockery left in him now, only a man trying to learn. "The old route book," she said. "A fellow wrote down every static level in this county before either of us was born. Nobody bothered to read it, because nobody had a reason to want water out there. The reason was cattle. It was cattle the whole time. The last visitor was the one she had been waiting for without knowing it. Merrill Voss came up the lane on a bright morning near the end of it, and he carried no clipboard this time. He stood by the overflowing tank and watched 4 black cattle drink where 2 winters back there had been nothing but dust. and he had the grace to look a little ashamed of the estimate he had written on her porch. "I'll be straight with you, Mrs. Rennick," he said. "The co-op's had 3 farmers this month ask me what you did out here. There are men on my line talking about pulling their meters." He turned his hat over in his hands. "I came to ask whether you'd sell some of that iron back. Those mills you keep in the shed, we'd use them for demonstrations. I'd pay you fair, same as scrap, seeing as that's the going rate." Ada looked at him a moment, and then she laughed, and it was the first easy laugh she had let herself have in 2 years. "Mr. Voss," she said, "there is no going rate. There is only what a thing is worth to the person who knows how to use it. You put a number on my pasture and called it an estimate, because you priced it by what it could pay you. I priced it by what it could grow. Those 13 mills in my shed are not scrap. They are the reason the 9 in the pasture never stop turning. I will keep every last one." Voss nodded slowly and let it go, because there is no arguing with a tank running over between 2 people. He drove back down the lane he had come up. Ada stayed a while longer, her hand on the cold galvanized rim. She watched the ridge where 9 fans turned against a pale spring sky. Below them, the herd moved easy across ground that had waited her whole life for a drink of its own water. By the next spring, the ridge had company. Wade Thorne was the first to climb back up a tower he had sold for scrap, and he came to Ada's shed for a cylinder and stayed a full day while she showed him how to seat a leather and set the stroke. 2 more men off the co-op line quietly re-raised their own mills that summer, pumping into stock tanks a mile from the nearest meter. Nobody made a speech about it. They had simply watched the Rennick cattle spread across country that used to lie empty, and they had run the same figures Ada had run alone at her kitchen table 2 winters before. The wind had always been free. It had only ever wanted somebody to prove what it was worth. Ada never charged a soul for the showing. A neighbor who could water his own back 40, she reckoned, was a neighbor who would still be farming beside her in 20 years, and she would rather have that than any scrap price. The land had not changed. It had held that water the entire time, waiting under 400 acres of grass no one would graze. All that changed was that one person finally counted the pasture by the size of the ring a cow could reach, and not by the price a company would charge to reach it. Everything else had been sitting there the entire season and every season before it, patient as the wind and free for the taking, waiting on nobody but a woman stubborn enough to count the ground right. So here's the question to sit with tonight. Picture your own back 40, useless your whole life. Would you take the wire the salesman offered and pay him every month to make it worth something? Or would you go looking, as Ada did, for the thing that was already yours and only needed spreading? If you've made it this far into the story, you already know which kind of farmer you are. Settle in and stay with us to the end of the next one.